What if the person you trusted most turned out to be a monster hiding in plain sight? For 1-year-old Kybrel Darrell, this question became a nightmare he could never escape. This is a story about trust, about a mother who let someone into her life, hoping for love and support, only to discover the horrifying cost of that decision. It is a story of innocence lost, a family torn apart, and a fight for justice that will leave you questioning how such darkness can hide behind a facade of normalcy. In California Borough, Pennsylvania, nestled in the heart of a seemingly peaceful town, this ordinary apartment complex became the backdrop for an unspeakable betrayal. Behind these walls, a child who should have been safe, loved, and cherished was fighting for his life. The events that unfolded inside this home would not only devastate a family but also send shockwaves through a community unaccustomed to such horrors. At the center of it all was Lyndon Henderson, a man trusted to care for 1-year-old Kybrel Darrell. But instead of protection, Kybrel found pain, a pain so severe it would leave him clinging to life in a hospital bed, his fragile body bearing the marks of unspeakable violence. California Borough, Pennsylvania, was the kind of town that seemed untouched by the chaos of the outside world. Nestled in Washington County, its quiet streets were lined with modest homes and well-kept yards. On any given day, neighbors exchanged polite waves as they walked their dogs, and children played under the shade of towering trees. It was a place where life moved slowly, a community where people felt safe leaving their doors unlocked. Yet, in one unassuming apartment complex on the town's outskirts, a darkness was festering, unseen by the outside world. Among the residents of this quiet town was Kybrel Darrell, a boy whose life had barely begun. At just 1 year old, he was a picture of innocence, a curious, joyful child with an infectious laugh and wide, expressive eyes. He was at that magical age where every new discovery brought squeals of delight. A wooden block clattered to the floor, and it was cause for giggles. A bird chirped outside the window, and Kybrel would look up, pointing, his tiny finger trembling with excitement. His mother, a young woman striving to create a life of stability for her son, carried the weight of single parenthood with quiet determination. Life had not been easy for her. Between juggling work and managing the daily challenges of raising a child, she bore the struggles of a woman trying her best in a world that often offered little in return. Yet, she loved her son fiercely. Every lullaby sung, every meal prepared, every late-night check on his crib was a testament to the depths of her devotion. It was this love that led her to seek companionship and support, someone to share the weight of responsibility. That someone was Lyndon Henderson, a 24-year-old man who had slipped into their lives with what seemed, at first, like genuine care and affection. To the outside world, Lyndon appeared to be an attentive boyfriend. He laughed with Kybrel, brought him small toys, and charmed his way into the small family's fragile world. But beneath this facade lay a different man, one whose dark tendencies would remain hidden until it was too late. There were moments, fleeting, subtle signs, that something wasn't quite right. Perhaps it was the sharpness in his tone when Kybrel cried for too long, or the way his smile sometimes felt forced. These warning signs, so easy to overlook in the daily grind of life, would later become the source of endless regret and questioning. As the days passed, Lyndon's presence in their lives grew more permanent. He became a fixture in the apartment, stepping into a role that Kybrel's mother hoped would bring stability. But this trust, placed in the wrong hands, would soon unravel in ways that no one could have foreseen. California Borough's serene streets, with their comforting familiarity, masked a growing storm within that apartment. For Kybrel, a world of discovery and joy was about to be replaced by something far darker, a betrayal so profound that it would leave the town reeling and his family irreparably broken. The innocence of this quiet community would be shattered, revealing a stark truth. Even in the most tranquil places, evil can hide in plain sight. The nightmare had begun, though no one in the small Pennsylvania town could have imagined the horror that was unfolding behind closed doors. It was November 23, 2024, a date that would forever be etched in the minds of those who lived in California Borough. Inside a modest apartment at the edge of town, a frantic 911 call shattered the morning calm. On the line was Lyndon Henderson, his voice trembling and rushed as he spoke of an accident. He claimed that Kybrel, a 1-year-old child entrusted to his care, had fallen off the couch and wasn't responding. The call was urgent, but the scene awaiting first responders was far worse than anyone could have anticipated. As the paramedics entered the apartment, the air was thick with an unnatural silence. The dim light from a single lamp cast long shadows across the sparsely furnished room. In the corner, toys lay scattered, their bright colors a stark contrast to the darkness enveloping the home. The faint hum of the refrigerator was the only sound until it was interrupted by the hurried steps of the medics. Kybrel lay motionless on the worn carpet, his small body unnaturally still. His skin, pale and fragile, bore bruises that were impossible to ignore. To the paramedics, the scene raised questions. The bruises on Kybrel's fragile frame and his unnatural stillness hinted at something far more troubling than an accident. There was no sign of a fall, no overturned furniture, no impact points that matched his condition. Outside, the wail of sirens pierced the early morning air, drawing the attention of neighbors who gathered anxiously at their windows. The flashing red and blue lights painted the streets in ominous hues, a stark warning that something had gone terribly wrong. Inside, the atmosphere was tense, with medics working in hushed urgency, their gloved hands moving swiftly as they assessed Kybrel's condition. His pulse was faint, his breaths shallow. Every second mattered. They stabilized him as best they could before rushing him to the ambulance. But even as they worked, a chilling unease settled over the responders. The severity of the injuries hinted at a story far darker than the one they had been told. Henderson stood to the side, his demeanor unervingly detached. His explanations about Kybrel's condition were hesitant, filled with pauses and contradictions. As the medics loaded Kybrel into the ambulance, the truth behind his injuries began to unravel, an unthinkable reality that would send shockwaves through the community. But the worst was yet to come. The ambulance sped away, its siren cutting through the quiet streets of California Borough, leaving behind a neighborhood now gripped by fear and confusion. Inside the dim apartment, officers began their work, carefully examining the scene for answers. The scattered toys, the worn furniture, the smudges on the walls, everything was scrutinized. And yet, the room held no immediate signs of the accident Henderson described in his frantic 911 call. Lyndon Henderson's demeanor was unervingly calm. His story remained simple, almost rehearsed. Kybrel had fallen off the couch, he insisted, hitting his head in the process. But the paramedics' observations painted a far grimmer picture. The bruises on Kybrel's delicate skin weren't localized to his head or indicative of a single fall. They were scattered, varying in shape and severity, suggesting something far more sinister. At the hospital, doctors worked to stabilize the boy, running tests and scans that would reveal the full extent of his injuries. Each new finding was more alarming than the last. A traumatic brain injury, a devastating blow that caused internal bleeding and swelling. A broken vertebra in his neck, an injury so severe it left no doubt it was caused by significant force. And the bruises, countless marks covering his small frame, told a story that Kybrel could not. This was no accident. The lead detective on the case, a seasoned officer who had seen his share of horrors, knew from the outset that something wasn't adding up. Accidents happen, but injuries like these don't align with a simple fall. They don't explain the hand-shaped bruises on Kybrel's arms or the faint outlines of marks that seemed almost deliberate. Henderson's version of events began to falter under questioning. At first, he stuck to his story. Then came the pauses, the hesitation, the vague responses when pressed for details. He couldn't explain why there were no signs of a fall, no blood, no disturbed furniture. And when detectives asked about the bruises, his answers grew increasingly defensive and inconsistent. With each new piece of evidence, the picture became clearer, though no less horrifying. The investigators meticulously pieced together the timeline, speaking with neighbors, reviewing medical reports, and examining the scene. What they uncovered pointed to a pattern of violence, acts of cruelty inflicted behind closed doors. The cracks in Henderson's story widened with every detail brought to light. His claim of carelessness was incompatible with the systematic nature of the injuries. This wasn't a moment of negligence, it was a calculated betrayal of trust, one that left a child clinging to life. As detectives worked late into the night, poring over every shred of evidence, one thing was becoming painfully clear. Kybrel's suffering wasn't the result of a tragic accident, but something far darker, more deliberate. The truth behind what happened in that apartment was beginning to emerge, and it was more horrifying than anyone could have imagined. As the investigation deepened, the weight of the tragedy settled heavily on Kybrel's family. No one felt it more deeply than his grandmother, Kybrel Darrell. She sat in her modest living room, the air thick with grief and disbelief, clutching a framed photo of Kybrel, a boy with a radiant smile that could light up any room. That smile was now a painful reminder of the innocence that had been so brutally taken. Carla's voice trembled as she spoke to reporters, her words cutting through the silence like a knife. "He was beat like a man," she said, her eyes welling with tears. "A man beat my grandson." The raw anguish in her voice was a window into the depth of her pain. A grandmother who had adored Kybrel, now grappling with the incomprehensible. Her sorrow wasn't just for what had happened, but for the trust that had been so devastatingly misplaced. Carla had welcomed Lyndon Henderson into their lives, believing he would provide care and stability. She had seen him hold Kybrel, laugh with him, even bring him toys. "We never thought he'd be capable of something like this," she admitted, the words heavy with regret. Guilt consumed her. In the quiet moments when no one was watching, she replayed the days and months leading up to the tragedy, searching for signs she might have missed. Could she have seen it? Could she have stopped it? These questions haunted her, their answers forever out of reach. But with the guilt came a fierce determination. "He didn't do anything to deserve this," she said through gritted teeth, her voice now steady with resolve. Kybrel's suffering, his fight for life, it couldn't be in vain. She vowed to see justice done, to ensure that the world knew the truth about what had happened to her grandson. Carla's anguish became a rallying cry, not just for her family but for the community that had watched Kybrel grow. Her pain was palpable, but so was her strength. She stood as a testament to the love that Kybrel had inspired, a love that now fueled her pursuit of accountability for the unspeakable betrayal that had shattered her family. The hospital room was silent but for the rhythmic hum of machines keeping Kybrel alive. Wires and tubes encased his small, fragile body, connecting him to monitors that beeped in steady intervals, each sound a reminder of how precarious his condition was. A crib meant for peaceful naps had become a battlefield where Kybrel fought for survival, his breaths shallow and mechanical under the weight of his injuries. The sterile atmosphere of the pediatric intensive care unit was a stark contrast to the storm brewing within his family. Outside the room, his mother sat with her head in her hands, her shoulders shaking as she wept quietly. Carla stood nearby, gripping a tissue so tightly it tore in her hand. Every glance at the child through the glass window of his room was a stab to the heart, each second spent waiting for news an eternity. Doctors had placed Kybrel in a medically induced coma, a necessary step to manage the swelling in his brain and give his body a chance to heal, if it could. The scans told a horrifying story: extensive internal bleeding, a traumatic brain injury that had robbed him of consciousness, a fractured vertebra in his neck, and bruises that no toddler should ever bear. The medical team worked tirelessly, but the weight of the situation bore down on them as well. One doctor, a seasoned pediatrician who had seen more than her share of tragic cases, struggled to contain her frustration as she addressed the family. "These injuries," she began, pausing as though the words themselves were too heavy to utter, "they are not accidental. There is no doubt. This was intentional." For the family, the confirmation was both devastating and enraging. Kybrel hadn't simply fallen, as Henderson had claimed. Someone had hurt him, someone who was meant to protect him. That truth ripped through them like a tidal wave, leaving them grasping for any semblance of understanding or control in a situation that offered neither. Prayers became the only thing they had left to hold on to. Carla knelt in a corner of the hospital's chapel, her hands clasped tightly as she whispered, "Please, God, don't take him. He's just a baby." Kybrel's mother, too overcome to speak, lit a candle and stared at its flickering flame, willing it to burn as brightly as her son's spirit once had. Hope, though fragile, remained. Kybrel's life hung in the balance, and every passing moment felt like a cruel test of their faith and endurance. Despite the grim prognosis, they clung to the possibility of a miracle. As the machines hummed on and the hours turned into days, one question echoed through the halls of that hospital: how could anyone do this to such a helpless, innocent child? As the investigation zeroed in on Lyndon Henderson, the man accused of turning an innocent child's life into a nightmare, detectives began to unravel the threads of his past. What they found was a portrait of a man whose history hinted at darker tendencies, warning signs that, in hindsight, raised troubling questions about whether this tragedy could have been prevented. Henderson, 24, had no significant criminal record, but those who knew him described a man who could be charming one moment and coldly distant the next. Former acquaintances painted a picture of someone who struggled with anger, a simmering temper that could ignite under pressure. Though he had managed to stay out of legal trouble, there were whispers of incidents, arguments that escalated, confrontations where his calm demeanor cracked. A former co-worker, speaking anonymously, recalled moments when Henderson's patience seemed paper-thin. It was small things that would set him off, they said. It's like he was holding back something bigger. To those on the periphery of his life, these moments were fleeting, easily dismissed. But in retrospect, they seemed like red flags ignored. Could this tragedy have been averted? That question haunted everyone involved. For Kybrel's family, it was a torturous thought. They had trusted Henderson, allowed him into their lives, and seen no clear signs of the darkness that lay beneath. "He never showed this side to us," Carla later lamented. "If we had known," her voice trailed off, the weight of her unspoken regret palpable. Experts weighed in, providing a chilling perspective on behaviors often exhibited by abusers. Dr. Emily Saunders, a psychologist specializing in child abuse cases, explained, "Abusers frequently cultivate an image of trustworthiness. They can appear attentive and caring in public while exhibiting controlling or violent behavior behind closed doors. This duplicity," she noted, "makes them difficult to detect until it's too late." In many cases, Dr. Saunders continued, there are subtle signs, an inability to handle stress, an unnerving tendency to deflect blame, or even disproportionate reactions to minor frustrations. Unfortunately, she added, these behaviors often don't raise alarms until a pattern of harm becomes evident. By then, the damage is already done. For Henderson, the facade he presented to the world had cracked. During questioning, his carefully maintained calm began to fray. His answers grew clipped and evasive, each pause or stutter further eroding the fragile facade he had built. Detectives noted his shifting demeanor, a quiet panic simmering beneath the surface as the weight of their questions bore down on him. The horror of misplaced trust loomed large over this case. To Kybrel's mother and grandmother, Henderson had seemed like a safe harbor, a partner who could help shoulder the weight of responsibility, a figure who would care for and protect their beloved child. That illusion had been shattered in the most devastating way. What made the betrayal even more chilling was its calculated nature. Henderson hadn't lashed out in a single moment of frustration. The injuries inflicted on Kybrel told a story of sustained violence, of someone capable of inflicting pain on the most vulnerable without hesitation. As detectives pieced together Henderson's past and psychologists provided insight into his behavior, one thing became clear. The man they had trusted had harbored a darkness far beyond what anyone could have imagined. For those left in the wake of his actions, the question of how to recognize such evil in the future, and how to prevent it, became a haunting and urgent concern. The weight of the evidence against Lyndon Henderson was undeniable, and the charges that followed reflected the severity of his alleged actions. He was arrested and formally charged with attempted homicide, a crime so heinous it left no room for bail. As he was led into custody, his face betrayed little emotion, a stark contrast to the devastation he had left in his wake. The legal system moved swiftly. Washington County District Attorney Jason Walsh addressed the public, his tone resolute and unwavering. "Children are our most vulnerable citizens," he declared, the emotion in his voice barely restrained. "When someone violates the trust placed in them to protect and care for a child, we will prosecute them to the fullest extent of the law." His words sent a clear message. There would be no leniency, no compromise in seeking justice for Kybrel. Inside the courtroom, tension hung thick in the air. Henderson sat at the defense table, his posture rigid, his expression carefully neutral. To some, it seemed like composure, to others, a chilling lack of remorse. Across the room, Kybrel's family huddled together, their faces etched with grief and anger. Carla, clutching a photo of her grandson, fought to keep her composure as tears brimmed in her eyes. The prosecution wasted no time in presenting their case. Graphic photos of Kybrel's injuries were displayed, each one a stark reminder of the violence he had endured. Medical professionals testified, their voices steady but filled with quiet outrage as they detailed the trauma to his small body. "These injuries," one doctor stated firmly, "are not consistent with a single fall. They are the result of repeated blunt force trauma." Henderson's defense team attempted to poke holes in the prosecution's narrative, clinging to the initial claim of an accidental fall. But with each witness, each piece of evidence, that narrative unraveled further. Detectives recounted Henderson's shifting stories, highlighting the discrepancies that had emerged during their investigation. Detectives carefully reviewed the medical findings and cross-referenced them with Henderson's version of events. The physical evidence painted a starkly different picture, one of deliberate and sustained harm. His explanation about a fall unraveled further as neighbors and witnesses recounted hearing arguments and unsettling noises from the apartment in the weeks leading up to the incident. For the family, the trial was an agonizing ordeal. Carla took the stand, her voice trembling as she recounted the moment she learned of her grandson's injuries. "He didn't have a chance," Carla said through tears, clutching a photo of Kybrel. "We let someone into our lives, and he took everything from us. How do you ever forgive yourself for that?" Her words, raw and full of pain, echoed through the courtroom. Through it all, Henderson remained impassive. He rarely looked at the witnesses, his gaze fixed straight ahead, betraying neither guilt nor innocence. To the jury, his stoicism could have been interpreted in a dozen different ways: calculated indifference, stubborn denial, or perhaps the weight of knowing the evidence against him was insurmountable. As the trial moved toward its conclusion, the prosecution delivered a powerful closing argument, emphasizing the trust that had been so horrifically betrayed. "Kybrel Darrell deserved safety, love, and care," the attorney said, his voice rising with conviction. "Instead, he was met with violence, inflicted by the very person who should have been his protector. This is not just a crime against one child, it's a crime against the fundamental principles of humanity." The courtroom fell silent as the jury retired to deliberate. Outside, reporters gathered, microphones in hand, ready to broadcast the latest updates in a case that had gripped the community. But even as the legal process played out, one question lingered in the minds of all who watched. Would Kybrel survive to see justice served? His fate, as fragile as his small body, remained heartbreakingly uncertain. The tragedy of Kybrel Darrell's case is not an isolated incident, but a stark reminder of the silent epidemic of child abuse that exists within our society. According to recent statistics, approximately 1 in 7 children in the United States experiences abuse or neglect annually, though many cases go unreported. In 2021 alone, Child Protective Services, CPS, received reports involving more than 3.9 million children. These numbers are staggering, yet they barely scratch the surface of a much larger, hidden problem. Child abuse often hides in plain sight, shielded by closed doors and cloaked in excuses like accidents or discipline. Many abusers, like Lyndon Henderson, cultivate an image of normalcy that makes their actions difficult to detect until the damage is irreparable. The question that haunts communities in the wake of such cases is, why didn't anyone see this coming? One of the reasons these cases often go unnoticed is a lack of awareness about the subtle signs of abuse. Bruises and injuries are obvious red flags, but not all signs of abuse are physical. Behavioral changes, such as a child becoming withdrawn, fearful, or excessively anxious, can also signal distress. Frequent absences from school, unexplained injuries, or a child flinching at sudden movements are warning signs that bystanders must take seriously. The responsibility to protect vulnerable children lies with everyone, not just family members or law enforcement. Friends, neighbors, teachers, and caregivers all play a critical role in identifying potential abuse and acting on their concerns. Experts emphasize that even small actions can make a difference. If you suspect a child is in danger, report it to your local child protective services or law enforcement. It is better to be wrong than to stay silent and risk a life. In cases like Kybrel's, the community often grapples with guilt for not recognizing the signs sooner. But this guilt can be transformed into action. By educating ourselves and others about how to recognize and respond to child abuse, we can create a safer environment for all children. The fight to end child abuse requires collective effort. Cases like Kybrel's remind us of the stakes. A single moment of inaction can have lifelong consequences for a child. But together, through vigilance, education, and a commitment to protect the innocent, we can prevent such tragedies and ensure that every child grows up in a safe, nurturing environment. As the courtroom battles unfolded and investigators pieced together the grim reality of Kybrel Darrell's suffering, his family remained steadfast in their pursuit of justice. Carla Darrell, his grandmother, emerged as the voice of the family. Her pain was a reflection of a broader truth. No child should endure what Kybrel had endured. For Carla and her family, this was not just about seeking accountability for the horrors inflicted on Kybrel. It was about ensuring his story served as a warning, a rallying cry for vigilance and change. "We can't bring him back to who he was before this," Carla said softly. "But maybe his story can save someone else." The impact of Kybrel's case reverberated far beyond the walls of that hospital and courtroom. It brought to light the hidden epidemic of child abuse and the urgent need for communities to act, to look closer, and to speak up when something doesn't seem right. Kybrel's innocence, so brutally violated, became a stark reminder of the fragility of trust and the importance of protecting the most vulnerable among us. The question lingered, heavy and unavoidable. How do we protect our children in a world where trust can so easily be betrayed? The answer lies in collective action, in education, and in refusing to turn a blind eye. Every cry ignored, every bruise excused, is an opportunity lost to save a life. And while the scars of this case will never fully heal for Kybrel's family, they hope that sharing his story will prevent others from experiencing the same heartbreak. As you watch this story and reflect on its harrowing truths, ask yourself, what can I do to protect the children in my community? How can I be the voice they need when they cannot speak for themselves? If you've been moved by Kybrel's story, we urge you to take action. Learn the signs of abuse, support organizations that fight for children's rights, and, most importantly, speak up when something doesn't seem right. Together, we can create a world where no child suffers in silence. If you found this video meaningful, consider subscribing to our channel. By doing so, you join a growing community committed to raising awareness and advocating for justice. Share this video, leave your thoughts in the comments, and help us ensure Kybrel's story, and the fight for children like him, reaches every corner of the world. Because no child should ever have to fight for survival alone. Thank you for watching. And thank you for standing with us.